Part 1. The Crime and the Confessions. Disclaimer. The following documentary discusses a real criminal case, including themes of wrongful conviction, police interrogation, and systemic failure. While explicit details have been omitted to remain advertiser-friendly and suitable for a wider audience, viewer discretion is advised. This video is intended for educational and informational purposes, based on official public records and court documents. In 1994, a sitting justice of the United States Supreme Court did something extraordinary. When the highest court in the land speaks, it is meant to be the absolute, infallible truth. Their words shape the very fabric of American law. Inside the pages of an official, legally binding Supreme Court opinion, this justice deliberately carved out the name of a specific man. He didn't just mention this man in passing. He used his case as a philosophical pillar to argue a terrifying point: that the ultimate sentence was not merely legally justified under the Constitution, but was morally necessary for the survival of justice itself. The man named by the High Court was Henry Lee McCollum. Justice Antonin Scalia wrote with a searing fury, describing the crime Henry had been convicted of as something so unspeakably monstrous, so entirely detached from human decency, that no reasonable person anywhere on earth could dispute the absolute righteousness of his sentence. The system had spoken. The highest legal minds in the land had verified it. There was no room for doubt, and that sentence was the harshest, most final punishment imaginable. But here is the chilling truth that Justice Scalia did not know, a truth that would eventually send shockwaves through the American legal landscape and completely dismantle the foundation of that very Supreme Court argument. Henry Lee McCollum had never taken anyone's life. He was completely, unequivocally innocent. And the undeniable forensic proof? It hadn't been buried deep in a secret location. It hadn't been deliberately destroyed, and it hadn't vanished into thin air. It had sat quietly in a poorly labeled North Carolina police evidence locker for over a decade. A single, ordinary cigarette butt collected from the grass, bagged in plastic, and entirely ignored by the people sworn to find the truth. It sat there, gathering dust in a dark room, while the state actively prepared its final chamber, waiting for a day when technology would finally reveal the DNA of the true perpetrator. If you want to uncover deeply researched true crime investigations that expose the dark reality of our justice system, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Tonight, we are unraveling 30 stolen years, a catastrophic failure at every single level of law enforcement, and the devastating story of two vulnerable brothers who refused to stop fighting for their innocence. Act 1. A Town in Terror. To fully understand how two innocent teenagers lost 30 years of their lives to the state, we have to look past the sterile environment of the courtroom and travel back to the late summer of 1983. The setting is Red Springs, North Carolina. In 1983, Red Springs was the quintessential picture of small-town America. It was a close-knit rural community surrounded by sweeping tobacco and soybean fields. It was the kind of place that left their front doors unlocked, where children played in the streets until dusk, and where everyone knew their neighbor's face and their family history. It was a place that felt perfectly safe. But in September of that year, the town's sense of rustic peace was violently shattered. An 11-year-old local girl named Sabrina Buie disappeared. One afternoon she was there, walking through her familiar neighborhood, and the next she had vanished into thin air. The hours ticked by. Afternoon shadows stretched into evening, and evening turned into a dark, terrifying night. For days, a suffocating dread hung over Red Springs. The community banded together, Search parties combed the surrounding back roads and thick woods with flashlights and tracking dogs. The search ended in absolute horror. Sabrina's lifeless body was discovered abandoned in a rural soybean field at the edge of town. She had been subjected to a brutal, unspeakable attack before her life was tragically taken. The sheer violence of the crime rippled through the community like an earthquake. Fear quickly turned into a raging collective fury. Parents locked their children inside, viewing every passing car with deep suspicion. A quiet town suddenly became a place of dark paranoia. The public didn't just want answers, they demanded immediate retribution. But a desperate police department is a dangerous thing. Instead of locking down the crime scene, meticulously gathering forensic data, and letting the physical evidence dictate the objective trajectory of their investigation, the authorities began chasing ghosts. Under immense pressure to deliver a quick victory, they turned their attention away from the soybean field and began listening to small-town rumors, locker room gossip, and street corner whispers. Weeks passed with no solid leads, until a local teenager, perhaps trying to clear his own name or perhaps just eager to please the anxious police, dropped a name to investigators. He claimed he had seen a 19-year-old local youth named Henry McCollum walking near the area around the time Sabrina went missing. There was no context provided. There was no supporting evidence. There was absolutely no logic to it. But for an under-fire police department looking for a fast victory to calm a terrified town, that single flimsy piece of hearsay was a lifeline. It was all it took to put a permanent, inescapable target on Henry McCollum, and by extension, it drew a target on his 15-year-old half-brother, Leon Brown. Act 2. The Perfect Targets. To understand what happened next, you must understand exactly who Henry McCollum and Leon Brown were in 1983. They were not hardened criminals operating in the shadows. They were not streetwise troublemakers. They were, in the most profound sense of the word, children. And more than that, they were incredibly vulnerable. Both Henry and Leon were born with severe intellectual disabilities. Henry's IQ was later measured in the low 60s. His younger brother Leon's cognitive functioning was even lower, with an IQ sitting somewhere in the 50s. In terms of practical mental capacity, these were teenagers operating with the comprehension levels of young grade school children. They could barely read, they could barely write, and they struggled significantly with basic problem solving and abstract thought. They were timid, easily confused, and highly susceptible to suggestion from authority figures. In a world where they desperately needed protection, they found themselves walking directly into a meticulously set trap. The police did not send a social worker. They did not contact a legal advocate. They simply swept in, picked up 19-year-old Henry, and brought him into the interrogation room. Imagine the sheer terror of that scene from his perspective. He is a frightened teenager with the mind of a child, locked in a small, windowless, heavily air-conditioned room. He is completely surrounded by grown men with badges, guns, and loud voices. They did not explain his constitutional rights in a way he could ever possibly understand. They didn't care that he couldn't comprehend the complex legal meaning of a Miranda warning. Instead, they launched a relentless, hours-long psychological assault. The detectives did not ask objective questions. They made aggressive declarations. They shouted at him. They slammed their hands on the metal table, the sound echoing in the small space. They told him they already knew he did it, closing off any avenue for him to defend himself. When Henry cried and desperately denied it, they changed tactics. They fed him specific, gruesome details about the crime scene, highly classified details that only the true perpetrator or the police could know.
Then, in a horrifying twist of manipulation, they turned around and used those very same details to claim that Henry must be guilty because he knew too much. Hours rolled into the dark of the night. The ticking clock on the wall was the only sound between the shouting. Henry was exhausted, hungry, deeply confused, and entirely broken. That's when the police offered him a way out, a classic manipulative lie used to break the vulnerable. They placed a thick stack of papers in front of him. The papers contained a detailed narrative confession written entirely by the detectives. They told him that if he just signed the paper, the yelling would finally stop. They told him that if he just put his name on the dotted line, he could stand up, walk out of the station, and go home to...
Part 2. The Trial and the Missing Evidence. Act 3. The Illusion of Justice. In 1984, the state of North Carolina officially put Henry McCollum and Leon Brown on trial for their lives. The atmosphere inside the courthouse was heavy, suffocating, and charged with the electric tension of a community that was still actively grieving and deeply, profoundly angry. The citizens of Red Springs filled the wooden benches, looking for the monsters who had shattered their peaceful town. But what unfolded before them was not a meticulous search for the objective truth. It was a courtroom drama designed specifically for a public that demanded immediate closure. Behind the formal legal procedures, the polished wooden tables, and the authoritative strike of the judge's gavel, the state's case was an absolute, terrifying, hollow shell. When you strip away the raw emotion from that 1984 trial, when you look past the tears and the outrage, you are left with a staggering, terrifying realization. The prosecution had absolutely zero physical evidence linking either Henry or Leon to the soybean field. Think deeply about the intense brutality of the tragedy. It was an intimate, violent struggle. By all laws of forensic science, a crime of that nature leaves an undeniable physical footprint. The perpetrator leaves something of themselves behind, and they take something of the victim with them. Yet investigators found absolutely nothing connecting these two disabled teenagers to the scene. There were no matching fingerprints left in the dirt or on the victim. There was no trace fibers from their clothing. There was no DNA, no hair, no skin cells, and no forensic trace of any kind whatsoever. The state's entire massive case against these two boys began and ended with those two single sheets of paper, the documents drafted and signed in the dark, intimidating confines of the police interrogation room. The defense attorneys faced a nearly impossible uphill battle. They tried desperately to argue that the confessions were entirely coerced. They tried to explain to the jury that these boys had the mental capacities of toddlers, that they had been paralyzed by fear, and that they had simply said whatever it took to make the nightmare of the interrogation stop. But the prosecution counterattacked with immense, overwhelming emotional force. They did not rely on science, they relied on shock value. They displayed graphic, heartbreaking photos of young Sabrina to the jury. They spoke with booming, authoritative voices about the horror inflicted on the town, whipping the courtroom into a frenzy. They deliberately painted Henry and Leon not as highly disabled, terrified boys, but as calculating, ruthless attackers who were cleverly wearing a mask of simplicity just to escape justice. To a jury that desperately wanted closure, a signed confession is the ultimate holy grail of evidence. In the 1980s, the general public couldn't even conceive of a reality where someone would confess to a horrific crime they didn't commit. They simply didn't understand the complex psychological mechanics of police coercion, especially when applied to a highly vulnerable, intellectually disabled mind. They saw a signature, and they saw guilt. After only a brief deliberation, the jury returned to the courtroom. The verdicts were swift and identical, guilty of the highest degree of the crime. The courtroom fell dead silent as the judge passed down the ultimate penalty. Both Henry McCollum and Leon Brown were given the ultimate sentence by the state. Because of his extremely young age, being only 15 at the time of the arrest, Leon's sentence would later be commuted to life in prison after a series of grueling, agonizing legal appeals. But for Henry, the system offered absolutely no mercy. He was marched in shackles down the long, sterile, echoing corridors of Central Prison in Raleigh, straight onto North Carolina's final tier for condemned inmates. He was only 19 years old. He would go on to become the state's longest-serving condemned inmate, spending the next 30 years staring endlessly at the drab concrete walls of an 8x10 cell. He spent 30 years waiting for the day the state would carry out the final procedure for a crime he had only ever read about through a forced, fabricated confession. But if you think you know how deep this tragic injustice goes, you don't. Because the true horror of this story isn't just that two innocent boys were locked away in maximum security cages and forgotten by the world. The true chilling horror is what the police willfully, deliberately chose to ignore while they were putting them there. Because while Henry and Leon were being processed into the prison system, the actual perpetrator was still walking the familiar streets of Red Springs, watching the evening news and realizing that the police had just handed him a free license to strike again.
When the highly anticipated DNA results finally came back from the state laboratory in 2014, the findings did not just quietly clear two men. The findings landed like a bomb, completely shattering the entire carefully constructed narrative of the North Carolina justice system. The microscopic traces of DNA found on that discarded cigarette butt did not belong to Henry McCollum. It did not belong to his younger brother, Leon Brown. It belonged to a convicted villain whose name should have stopped this entire sprawling tragedy 30 decades earlier. It belonged to a man named Roscoe Artis. Now we must look at the most damning, unforgivable aspect of this entire story. We must ask the question that haunts this case. Who exactly was Roscoe Artis? Roscoe Artis was not some untraceable, mysterious stranger who just happened to pass through the quiet streets of Red Springs in the fall of 1983. He was a permanent resident of the town. In fact, at the exact time of Sabrina Buie's tragedy, Roscoe Artis lived in a house located less than 100 yards from the very soybean field where her body was discovered. He lived so close that he could literally see the crime scene from his own neighborhood. He could likely see the police tape, the flashing lights, and the investigators walking through the field. But the story gets infinitely, terrifyingly worse. Less than one single month after Sabrina Buie was attacked, while Henry and Leon were sitting in small, cold jail cells being prepared for a trial that would ruin their lives, Roscoe Artis struck again. In the exact same town of Red Springs, he viciously attacked and took the life of an 18-year-old girl named Joni Bradley. The crime scene signatures between the two tragedies were almost perfectly identical. The geographic location was the exact same small community. The specific level and type of violence used against the victims was perfectly mirrored. Roscoe Artis was eventually caught by authorities for the horrific attack on Joni Bradley. He was convicted in a court of law, and he was sentenced to life in prison. Think deeply about what this sequence of events actually means. In 1983, the Red Springs Police Department had a brutal, highly publicized crime involving a child in a local soybean field. 1 month later,
a man living just 100 yards from that exact field commits an almost identical crime against a young woman. Any competent investigator, any basic law enforcement officer with a rudimentary understanding of criminal behavior would have instantly connected the dots. They would have looked at the geography, the timing, and the methodology, and they would have realized that the man who attacked Joni Bradley was almost certainly the exact same man who harmed Sabrina Buie. But the police didn't look at Roscoe Artis for Sabrina's case. They didn't even try. Why? Because admitting that Roscoe Artis was the true perpetrator meant admitting to the public that their signed, highly publicized confessions from two disabled teenagers were a complete and total lie. It meant admitting to the community that they had broken the law, violated constitutional rights, and manipulated two vulnerable children just to secure an easy arrest. So, to protect their own professional reputations and preserve their bureaucratic win, the justice system developed a fatal case of total tunnel vision. They allowed the true perpetrator to be put away for a completely different crime, while actively, knowingly forcing two innocent boys to take the devastating fall for a tragedy they had absolutely nothing to do with. They sacrificed the lives of Henry McCollum and Leon Brown on the altar of bureaucratic pride and public relations. Act 7. Freedom and Fallout. In September 2014, exactly 31 years after the nightmare first began in that windowless interrogation room, a North Carolina courtroom fell completely, stunningly silent. Defense attorneys, armed with the undeniable truth, laid the official DNA results from the Innocence Inquiry Commission squarely on the judge's heavy wooden bench. The scientific evidence was completely unassailable. There was no room left for debate, no legal maneuvering, and no lies. Facing the undeniable, objective truth, the state prosecution finally had absolutely no choice but to concede their case. The presiding judge looked out at the packed courtroom, took his gavel, and officially vacated the decades-old convictions of Henry McCollum and Leon Brown. He ordered their immediate, unconditional release from the state prison system. The heavy iron doors of Central Prison swung open with a loud echo. Two men slowly walked out into the blinding, unfamiliar North Carolina sunlight. When they had been violently dragged out of their homes by the police, they were just terrified teenagers, 15 and 19 years old, with their whole lives ahead of them. Now, as they stood on the pavement as truly free men, they were middle-aged, gray-haired men in their late 40s and early 50s. The world they cautiously stepped into was entirely foreign to them. The cars looked different, the technology was unrecognizable, and the community they once knew was gone. Their beloved parents, who had fought so hard for them, had either grown frail and old or passed away while they were locked inside. Their youth was permanently gone, completely consumed by the harsh, unforgiving gray walls of a maximum security prison. The sudden exoneration became a massive, unavoidable international headline. The legal irony was staggering. The specific case that Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia had famously used to boldly defend the moral necessity of the ultimate sentence had suddenly turned into the single most devastating, undeniable argument against it. The governor of North Carolina officially stepped forward and issued full, unconditional pardons of innocence to both brothers. The state publicly acknowledged the horrific, life-altering miscarriage of justice that had been so casually inflicted upon them by the very system sworn to protect them. Years later, a federal civil jury attempted to do the only thing the justice system could still do. They tried to put a monetary price tag on 30 years of stolen life. After a grueling, highly emotional trial that fully exposed the systemic malice, the deliberate cover-ups, and the extreme negligence of the original 1983 investigation, the jury returned a historic verdict.
They awarded Henry and Leon $75 million in compensatory and punitive damages. It remains the largest wrongful conviction settlement in United States history. But if you sit down and ask Henry and Leon today, they will tell you the heartbreaking truth. No amount of money, no matter how many millions of dollars are deposited into a bank account, can ever buy back 30 years of a human life. $75 million cannot return the precious childhood milestones they missed. It cannot heal the severe physical toll of spending decades in maximum isolation, and it can never, ever erase the profound, lingering psychological trauma of waking up every single morning for 30 long years, knowing deep in your soul that you are completely innocent, and knowing that the entire world is patiently waiting to carry out a final, fatal sentence against you anyway. Henry McCollum and Leon Brown ultimately survived the crushing machinery of the state, but their lives stand today as a permanent, haunting warning to us all. It is a story that conclusively proves just how easily the blind, desperate pursuit of a quick conviction can completely blind the eyes of justice to the absolute truth. And as we look at their empty, cold, concrete cells today, it forces us to confront a terrifying, deeply uncomfortable question. How many more innocent men and women are currently sitting in the dark of their cells right now, praying for the day the world finally stops to listen?